Hello, and welcome to this episode of Transact SQL by Mr. Trevor. The title of today's episode is Null versus Empty Character String, also known as Whitespace. In SQL, table columns are typically defined as being either null or not null. As here in this table, the authors table, we can clearly see that we have three columns defined. The primary key, author ID, which is defined as not null, and first name followed by last name, and both of them are defined as null. When defined as null, the column is allowed to have no value at all. When defined as not null, the column must have a corresponding value. When tables are populated with data, some records will have fields without valid data, but will have whitespace inserted instead. From that point thereafter, it is not always easy to determine which field is null and which field is hosting whitespace, because visually they look the same. That is, they are both blank. I will now go ahead and display the contents of the authors table as a demo. We're going to select all from the authors table to see what the contents are. And there we have the entire list of records being displayed. So we have a total of 167 records in this table. However, starting with record 159 to 167, the first name and last name fields are both blank. The question is, are those null, or are they simply hosting empty string characters or whitespace? And to determine that, we're going to do a quick little test. I have this little script prepared, and this one is testing for null. Now, when you test for null, we're not testing for an equality, as in first name or last name equal null. Because since null is defined as nothing, in other words, no value, you cannot test to see whether null or the field is equal to null. What you have to do is use the is null condition to test whether or not a null is existing. So let's run that test, and I'm going to send the results to text and rerun it, and there we are. The result set shows 0 records affected. In other words, it found no null at all in the records that are blank. So moving on, we're going to test again, but this time we're testing for whitespace to see whether or not those blank records are simply empty character strings, or as we call it, whitespace. So here we're testing using the equal operator to determine whether or not the first name or last name is equal to whitespace. And we're going to send the results to text, and we're going to run. So here we go. Aha! And clearly we found 9 rows are affected. That is, the result set has returned 9 rows, starting with author ID 159 to 167, and they show that the first name field and the last name fields are blank for all 9 records, which indicates that whitespace or empty character strings are valid in that they have a value, but they are hosting 0 characters, whereas null has no value, so it returned nothing. And that concludes the test for null characters versus empty string or whitespace.